Welcome to the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast hosted by yours truly, Dr. Adrian Campbell. This week, for episode 28, I have my dear friend, Daneil Baumer, to chat about how his experiences in the Army, law enforcement, and life in general led him to find healing through creativity, including becoming a published novelist. I hope you enjoy. So welcome to the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast hosted by yours truly, Dr. Adrian Campbell. This week for episode 28, I have my dear friend, Daneil Baumer, to chat about how his experiences in the Army, law enforcement, and life in general led him to find healing through creativity, including becoming a published writer. Now, a little bit about Daneil. He is a U.S. Army veteran with varied geographic background. Excited to hear more about that. Having lived from coast to coast, later in life, after he realized the effects that unrecognized trauma can have on him, he decided to shift into the art world as a photographer and writer. His debut novel, The Stone Harvest, was a product of years of introspection, self-directed therapy, and acknowledgement that he had something worthwhile to share. He wishes to be a role model for others who want to use art and creativity to overcome their personal darkness. Welcome, Dan. So glad to have you here with us.
Thank you very much. I am happy to be here. I've watched many of your shows. I've seen how great of a guest, of a host you are, and how gently you treat them when they're nervous like this. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Nothing to be nervous about. Like I tell everybody, this is just a conversation between us that bunches of people will end up listening and watching too.
Wonderful.
So it's fine.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Nothing, because we don't edit. It's live. We just see what happens and we throw it out into the world.
That a lot could go wrong. A lot could go wrong. If you know me, the things that I say, no, I'm not at all worried about it all. You're extraordinarily wonderful host, and I've seen your shows, and all your guests are happy.
Awesome. Well, hopefully you'll be happy too. So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about yourself? Like, where did you grow up? Where'd you come from?
I am a California boy. Born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. I say hella a lot and hecka. That's just a regional thing. I've had to force myself to stop saying that. That's just one of the Northern California things. I moved around a little bit during my childhood, moved between parents, had a otherwise normal childhood. Wouldn't call it privileged by any stretch of the imagination, but it wasn't a horrible one. It was just a nice, boring suburban childhood, which left me horribly unprepared for the rigors of the military. I hadn't met that many different types of people before, and I hadn't done those types of things before. So,
even growing up in the Bay Area,
I was a what's the word for it? I was a mama's boy. I wasn't protected, and maybe mama's boy is too strong, but I was shy. I was an introvert. Still, I'm kind of an introvert.
Yeah.
I didn't get into trouble. I was a good boy. Didn't want to give my mom any grief.
The opposite of me. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't want to say it. But that's, we'll talk more about the military. But just just a California kid, for all the good and bad that could be. Joined the military, traveled a whole bunch, met a whole bunch of vastly different people than me. And it made me realize that thank goodness that I had the background that I did, because it made me thankful for it. But also that made me thankful for the fact that not everybody's like me, that diversity is a good thing, different types of people and personalities. The suburbs were the suburbs, and as diverse as California can be, there's a certain type of homogeny that the suburbs in the Bay Area had.
Right.
And boy, howdy, joining the military was an awakening. Not always for good things. It was quite difficult to handle. And of course, handling difficult things makes you wiser and stronger, but it's not always welcome.
Right. And how old were you when you joined?
Let's see, I joined a year after high school. So I
Okay.
was an older 18-year-old. I was a mature 18-year-old.
Gotcha. But see, it
Yeah.
feels older because so many of them join young, because I joined at 19. I turned 20 in boot camp, and I felt old compared to a lot of people that I was in with.
Well, I did join with a lot of people on what was called the delayed entry program, where
Right.
they join in like the summer before their senior year of high school, do some light training, and then as soon as their high school graduation gets done with, they go right into training. There was
Right.
a lot of those folks, and I did seem a little bit more mature than them, only because I'd been working and had to have a
Mhm.
job and got some touch with reality. They just went straight to school, into the army, into boot camp, which in some ways is a benefit because they didn't know any better.
Yeah.
Uh, that's kind of what the military, harsh word, military
But
preys on,
yeah,
the younger unformed minds.
it's easier because they're more
Yeah.
pliable. And I mean, in a lot of the research I've done specifically around boot camp, the stronger the individual ego is when they enter that field, because that's what boot camp is a shaping field, right?
Hmm.
The more resistance is found, and actually the harder it is on the individual, because there's so much more breaking down and letting go that has to occur versus someone that's just like, teach me, shape me. Oh, there's Bella. We knew she'd make an entrance at some point.
Right.
Well, there's your going wrong, Dan. Meow.
Right. See, it's going straight to heck. But to get back on track, you're entirely right. The young unformed mind it makes it easier to yell at them, make them do push-ups, and
Yeah.
there's no argument.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry that Bella stole your thunder there.
It's a regular occurrence. It's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Not to say that I was a fully formed human at 18, 19 years
Right.
old. I turned 19 when I was in training. I certainly was not. I didn't consider myself a fully formed human until my mid 30s, or a mature human until my mid 30s, and that was that's another story. But joined the military from 88 to 95. Got to see the world a little bit. Got to see Europe at least. A station in
Mhm.
Germany was my first duty station, and it was a very, very boring duty, but it allowed me to travel and see another world.
Mhm.
As you certainly know, I'm
Yeah.
German. I got to see some of my family while I was over there, and in the 2.5 years that I was stationed in Germany, I got to visit many of the prime cities, many of the big cities that people go over there just to specifically visit, and I got to go visit them on a weekend via a train. And
Right.
it was a wonderful experience. I got to visit small towns and large, and I saw a whole bunch of different types of people. My German, even to this day, is not good, but many Germans speak English as well, if not better than many Americans. So thankfully, while over there, both back in the 80s, 90s, and more recently, I relied
Mhm.
on the knowledge that Germans have of my language.
Well, and I think you hit on like an important part too of like learning about diversity in the military. It's not just the people we serve with, but it's the places that we go and where we get to travel and the experiences that we have. I mean, I didn't get to go to Europe, but I went to, I mean, all over Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, South America.
Hmm.
And, you're going there as like kind of an ambassador of the United States. You're a military member, so you need to like behave yourself, or at least you should.
Should.
Not everyone
Yeah.
does, but you should. And I also remember like there's just a greater sense of safety being over there as a military member versus when I travel abroad now as like an ordinary citizen. And it just allowed me to explore a lot of things in a lot of places, with I guess, a young, open mind. And so I think that
Hmm.
really like helped shape the way I looked at the world. And I think for a lot of young military members, that travel and those experiences also help us see, the benefits of diversity.
Absolutely. Mark Twain, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't know the exact quote, but he has a quote along the lines of that travel is a cure for ignorance.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh, doesn't teach you everything, but it lets you know a little bit about what you previously didn't know. Lets you know about other people,
Mhm.
other colors, other flavors, other smells, how people communicate. And in my travels to various countries, what I've realized is that people do the same thing everywhere. They just
Mhm.
do it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
People shop, people get married, people want to, boys and girls want to get together, boys and boys want to get together. Doesn't
Right.
matter the country, doesn't matter the language. Everybody wants to do the same thing. They just do it a little bit differently.
Mhm.
And whether it was that microcosm of the boot camp and seeing how people did it differently, or going overseas to the various countries that I visited in Europe and seeing how
Right.
people did it differently, it was a reminder that we're all kind of the same
Yeah.
people for the
Yeah.
most part.
I mean, foundationally, not to be cheesy, but I will because I'm good at it. We all just want to live our lives and be loved and have a peaceful existence for the most part. I think that's what most people want. And, you're absolutely right. Like being able to explore those different cultures and see those similarities reminds us that we are one people. Like there's, the nationality splits and all of that. There's so many things, but from a grand scheme point of view, it's kind of just made up labels and lines. And at the end of the day, like we're all one, we're all human beings. So,
Correct. And we make up plenty of reasons to not get along.
yes, we're
Uh,
very good at that.
yes, we have a fine history of finding reasons to not get along. And I won't get into this is not a discussion about human nature in that
No,
regards.
we
Uh,
went on a sidetrack off the deep
yeah,
end. Let's swim
and,
back to shore.
yeah. And another thing,
So you were in Germany.
I was in Germany, uh, and I was still in the military, and I got stationed in Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And again, different way of doing things. Same army, different way of doing it. I had been stationed overseas in Germany in a very tiny little duty station where it was small army. The big army seemed to have forgotten about us. But then I got stationed at Fort Jackson, which is big army, a TRADOC post, big training post, a lot of generals going around, and we had to be shiny a lot and iron our uniforms.
Yeah.
Lame, but it was just different type of army. So it was
Right.
another uh, example of diversity while being within a single unit.
Mhm.
Now that's where I began as a law enforcement officer. I had always been an MP, but I wasn't doing law enforcement duties. And as we get into the book and creativity and some issues about trauma,
Mhm.
law enforcement may come up again. Uh, I then went on to work at a jail, a military correction facility up in Alaska of all places. Loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it. Not the working in a jail part, but being in
I was
Alaska.
like, really? Really? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
working in a jail on many levels, not horrible duty.
Mhm.
You're inside. You don't have to shovel snow. You don't have to go camping in the snow. Not like those very tough and awesome infantry guys. God bless them. No, thank you. We got to work inside,
Yeah.
but you're dealing with a lot of people that have issues. So whatever issues they have, they share it with everybody. So you're kind of
Mm.
in this hot box of negative emotion, and it's wearing.
Right.
And again, not to get into trauma, but uh, things happen inside of a prison that
Mhm.
the regular population doesn't know about, the regular world doesn't know about,
Mm.
that doesn't happen in the daily lives of others.
Mhm.
So looking back on my military time, I'll say this. I'm not a combat veteran. I don't have traditional combat stories, and I'm thankful that I don't. Uh, my work was a military police officer, where I was working with in a law enforcement capacity. And on an almost daily basis, you're coming into contact with the negative aspects of humanity, the things that people do to each other, their loved
Right.
ones, their family members. I'm not going to get into it when this is not a therapy session, but we all know the horrible things that people can do to each other.
Mm.
And that was very impactful, negatively impactful on me as this young, almost mama's boy from a semi-protected, bland suburb going into this world. My brain had troubles processing it.
Well, yeah,
So
'cause how old were you when you were
I
out
was,
there?
like I said, I joined when I was 18, spent a
Mhm.
couple years in Germany. I was a 21-year-old, roaming the streets with a gun.
Yeah, yeah,
And you've got a strong law enforcement background yourself, in addition to your research.
right.
You know the things that happen on the street, and you know the training required, or that should be required, to go into these situations. And you
Yeah,
know the mental blowback that could happen after these situations. Well, they don't give MPs
right.
any of this training. It just basically, here's a gun. Can you qualify? Okay, go out and handle domestic violence situations. Go go
Gosh,
out and
yeah.
go out and handle these other horrible situations. All right, your shift's over. Go home. See you tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, and then the only reason I asked about your age is because the human brain doesn't even stop developing, especially in males, until you're 25,
Hmm.
right? And so there's all these studies that have been done on, especially like military, whose brains are still developing in traumatic situations or trauma-inducing situations, and how that has a much more negative impact, right, on the lots of different areas in the brain. But yeah, so you were young. I mean, you didn't have the training to deal with what you were dealing with. You were surrounded by a bunch of negativity and crap, human crap. And your brain was still trying to figure out how to be a full functioning human at that point.
Sure. And at the time, what do? You soldier on. You just suck it
Mhm.
up and soldier on. And at the time, there was not a whole lot of negative repercussions from it, or so I thought. Looking back,
Yeah.
my relationship with my then wife suffered because
Mhm.
I couldn't emote, and all those things. We'll probably touch on that later. But uh, my brain was unformed, and I experienced things that I uh, received negative repercussions for. I don't know how else to put
Yeah.
it. It was
Yeah,
uncool.
it was. That's a great way to
And
put it.
it was uncool, yeah. And I was so wizened by the experience that the moment I got out of the military, I joined the police force because I had a cape complex. I
Yeah.
wanted to do my duty. It's what I've been doing. I didn't recognize the effects it had on me just yet.
Mhm.
I thought everything's fine. I should be drinking this much.
Did you say a cape complex?
Yes.
Yeah, I got, you know what? I've never heard it put that way, but it is so fitting. Yeah, the cape
Yeah.
complex. Mhm.
So it was a natural transition for me to become a civilian law enforcement officer.
Well, I mean,
And
I almost went into law enforcement when I got out because it's a very easy transition and it just makes sense, right? Like you just go from one uniform to the other. Everything is made real simple, real streamlined. So I mean, a lot of coasties do it because we have so much law enforcement, and
mhm.
I know MPs are the same way.
And some can handle it just fine. Maybe they had a different maturity level than I do, or maybe they've got a different background that I do, or maybe I can't speak for others.
Sure.
Uh, but it seemed like a good idea at the time, and it just didn't work out. If law enforcement were all kicking in doors and gunplay and car chases, I'd have been the best cop ever. I was great at that stuff. Uh, but when it came down to how humans treated each other, it
Mhm.
affected me a lot. And it
Yeah.
affected my marriage, and we had troubles.
Mhm.
And the chief and I had a great chat about it. The chief at the time of the police department was a very wise man, and he convinced me that my future lay elsewhere. Were I continue this, I'd be damaging myself and my family a whole lot. And he was right.
Mm-hmm.
Because even in that short time that I was a civilian police officer, uh, civilians lack the discipline and order that is on a military installations, and you've got problems that are tenfold worse than on a safe, orderly military installation.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't fun. So law enforcement wasn't for me.
Well, I'll just take a minute to like applaud the fact that like you were able to make that decision and leave, and that you had wise counsel from a chief. Like that's really huge, because I've talked to many friends and many people I've met over the years who didn't have that, or didn't leave even though they knew it was tearing them up inside, because it wasn't possible for them to see past where they were at. Like they just felt stuck. It takes a lot to move away from a career that you've been in for a while.
Right. And I can't say that I was a total fan of the idea at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I resigned, not happy with the idea entirely, not entirely buying in, but I had done enough damage to my personal life that it was the trajectory was pretty clear. So the chief, bless his heart, talked me into a good decision over my objections.
Good.
So good for him.
Yeah.
I still am a strong supporter of law enforcement. Other law enforcement officers are some of the biggest heroes I've ever met.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there are bad cops. There's no doubt about it. But I've met numerous heroes that wear the badge. So there's no doubt about that. It's just best that I didn't continue there.
Got it. So what'd you do next?
I worked in bars.
You just like rowdy people, I think.
I don't think you're wrong. I
Hey,
like.
wait, is that why we're friends?
Yeah. Yes, you are such a little delicate wallflower, you.
Oh my God.
No, years later I thought about why I liked being a bartender. I liked the physical barrier between me and those people. I could take care of those people. And I'll be back here doing my little alcoholic chemistry. But I don't have to interact as much. It was fine. Worked in hospitality for years, a lot of management. I think restaurant work is hard, management or otherwise. So be nice to your servers, be nice to your restaurant managers, for goodness sakes. Those folks, they take a lot of crap from people. So that's what I did. But later, not to skip large portions of my life, but much of it doesn't pertain to why we're talking here.
Yeah.
Around 2011, I finally got up the nerve to do something that I'd always wanted to do. There's always been a little part of me since I was a little kid. I wanted to be in a musical.
That's
I wanted to be in a play, specifically a musical. And one came to town at our community theater, and I thought, I was out of excuses. I had the schedule for it. My kids were old enough. It was close enough. I knew some of the people involved, but I had no experience. And I auditioned and I got a good role. And overall, it was a magnificent, life-changing experience because it exposed me to a number of things. Most importantly, it exposed me to how mentally altering theater specifically can be. All art can be. But for me, in that instance, specifically theater, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Theater. Let me talk more a little bit about the experience first. I was cast as a character whose beliefs and actions were entirely contrary to mine, and the character was mean to a group of people. His actions were anti-Semitic. And that's, it's just not my vibe. And he was exceptionally mean. And I had to make this character believable. And I talked to the director and I said, look, I don't know about yelling this stuff. I don't feel comfortable. She gave me some great advice about how to internalize it without becoming it. And it was difficult, but I did well and I got through it. What the experience taught me was that it's just a face. And it made me realize that I had been wearing faces my whole life.
Yeah.
I wore a face in the army. I wore a face as a police officer, and that whatever true self I had was still kind of hidden. So it was just a matter of swapping this face on. It takes more than that to be a decent actor, and I won't say I was a good actor, but it takes more than that. But it's just a matter of learning the face and swapping it out and using it. You've got to read the text, the script. You've got to embody what you think the playwright intended for this, and you've got to feel what the character must be feeling. So you've got to step outside yourself and try these alternative beliefs. Now I'm getting heavy here. Sometimes plays can just be fun and funny. They are. But
sometimes even the fun characters is a step away from maybe even where you are in life in that moment.
Yes, absolutely. Comedy is absolutely an art form that oftentimes comes from pain and loss. So even fun things can be therapeutic. Now, a dear friend of mine pointed something out to me, and I'm using his words about theater, whether as a patron or a performer. And this goes back to what I was saying about having to get the character. It's an opportunity to be empathetic to somebody that you might normally not be. So you're a patron. As a patron, you get this broadcast of characters that you want to enjoy, but to enjoy them, you've got to feel them a little bit. So you're going to be bombarded with situations and emotions that if you don't have an open heart and an open mind for, if you just kind of sit there because your partner dragged you to it, you're not going to. And there's plenty of that, and that's okay as long as you buy the ticket and support the theater. But if you sit there with closed body and closed mind, you're not going to be open to the idea of what other people are thinking and feeling. And whether you're in the theater or at Walmart, closed to other people, probably safer at Walmart to do that. But wherever you're at, if you're closed-minded, you're not going to encounter new thoughts of other people.
Well, and I always loved how not even just like the characters themselves, but the situations that they're in. Like for me, like theater and movies and things like that, like it gives you the opportunity to be a part of an experience that you may never otherwise have opportunity to be a part of, right?
Sure. There's a musical play and a movie that we've talked about before called The Last 5 Years. Jason Robert Brown basically wrote his breakup story. That popular play and movie is just his breakup story. So he took his pain and made something well loved, respected, and something that's beautiful out of it. Charles Bukowski, a well-known ne'er-do-well and barfly and poet, lived a dirty life and did dirty things. And that's judgmental of me to say, but if you read his history and his work, you could see he spent some time in the gutter, God bless him. But even he took his pain and made beautiful things out of it. He, despite his self-loathing or how he viewed his own damage, he could turn the most beautiful phrases from his broken love or his lost love. My 6-foot goddess makes me laugh. the laughter of the mutilated who still need love. So, as unworthy as he thought he might be, he also thought that he had the potential for being worthy of love. And he turned that into his poetry. And he's got scads of poetry about his pain and his loss. And much of his work is very funny and entertaining and bawdy. But you could see that he's writing his poison out. And I just think it's fantastic.
And I know like the theme of this show or whatever is talking about like healing through creativity and putting our pain out into art. But as a patron, as someone who reads poetry, because I love poetry, right? And someone who watches these plays where these characters are going through so much, I think it gives the opportunity for us to sometimes tap into that pain that is similar within ourselves. Like, it's like there's that, like our daily lives and running around and doing all the things we're doing, we don't always have time to think or be in that type of pain if we're lucky enough to not be completely consumed by it, right? And I think reading that type of poetry, viewing that type of art gives us that space and time to connect with that part of ourselves that is hurting and needs to be heard. And so even without us speaking it, we're sharing that energy and exploring that space for ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. Which goes back to, not being like this at the theater. You're there willingly to bask in whatever's being thrown out from the stage. Yeah. Some of it hits, some of it doesn't. What hits you might be because you've walked that same road before, or you've had shared experiences with the character. You've had a breakup because of the same reasons, or you felt that same pain. That's why some songs are so sweet, because we felt that same exquisite sense of love,
or anger, or hate,
or anger, or
or whatever it may be. But there's an emotion sharing, that takes place. Yeah,
absolutely. So that's the basis for a lot of, not enough, but a lot of military folks throughout the years. World War I is famous for its poets. There's poetry, and I mean, even look at war movies. War movies don't take all the good experiences. They don't take the happy tales. They go after the bad things. They take the pain and the sadness and the horrible nature of war, and they make art out of it. Sometimes it's just for pure entertainment purposes, but often it's for additionally for education purposes. We feel those things. We feel the heroism. We feel the loss of a buddy, or whatever the situation might be.
Poets, I was just gonna, not to pull it totally, but in like from a Jungian standpoint, from a Jungian frame, there's the collective unconscious, and there's these archetypal energies and archetypal stories that take place year after year after year. I mean, since human beings ever became, right, emerged, whatever, grew. And when we watch those films, like when somebody watches a movie on war that has never been in the military, that has no experience with it whatsoever, because we're all part of the collective, being in that space, there's something about the art that transports you and connects you to that collective energetic space. So that's why, I think people watch these movies and they feel like they can understand what's happening and what that feels like, even though they've never been there. And I think a lot of it is that shared collective energy that we all have, and art helps us connect to each other.
Despite the lack of shared experiences, it's certainly still possible. I'm a fan of Wuthering Heights, believe it or not, and I'm certainly not of that background. It's just beautiful prose for the sake of beautiful prose. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the love story behind it. I'm blushing a little bit, but it's a wonderful story.
It is. Right. Yeah.
Not my chosen genre to read. This. I read other things. But despite the lack of a shared background, as long as you could feel that story, you're going to meld with it.
Mm-hmm.
Roughly about the same time I got into theater, I read something, a snippet from a crime novelist author uh, that I was reading at the time, and it is 2 paragraphs, and it's the absolute inspiration for me wanting to be a writer. And
Are
the
you going to
fact
read
that
it to us? Do you have it?
I have it, and I'm going to read it to you. And it keep in mind this is from a crime novel. You know, people die,
Got
guns blazing. You know, a crime novel, and this is why I love all forms of fiction, because any form of fiction can paint any type of picture if the writer knows what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
and if they choose to. You could have a slow, languid piece with lots of great excitement based on how the guy writes it or the writer writes it. Or you could have this crime story where this drunk private investigator is lamenting the woman who used to love him, and he is reminiscing about a past time, and he knows he's got a rough future ahead of him, so he's enjoying the moment of this memory. And this is the passage that made me want to become a writer. It's from John Straley's The Woman Who Married a Bear. The sun dappled in through the canopy of the limbs, and Hannah moved slowly through the graves to the edges of the clearing where the berry bushes crowded each other, reaching for the light. The berries were soft and thick with juice, loosely hung on their stems. Sacks of color and flavor like eggs ripe in the bellies of the salmon running up the stream. There were wildflowers among the graves, shooting stars, bog orchids, and the deadly monkshood. I remember feeling I could have been underwater, watching her swim naked over a tropical reef, but she was walking in and out of shadow, reaching up for the berries and gently placing them in a plastic bucket she had hung around her neck. Sometimes the upper limbs of the bramble would catch her blonde hair, and as she stepped forward, one of them would lift a strand into the light, as if it were a broken web blowing out from a doorway. He is still in love with her, and throughout the novel he refers to her as the woman who used to love me.
Mm.
And this is a hard-drinking, hard-boiled private detective, and he still has these thoughts and feelings for this woman. And I felt that was an extraordinarily poignant dichotomy in the style of in the writer's style. I don't think dichotomy is the right word. I just thought it was interesting that he could put such beautiful imagery
Mm-hmm.
in this book, and he does it several times in there. And this passage inspired me so greatly. It made me realize that even a crime story could have that kind of beauty, the image of the spider web. And I immediately started writing. I was living in Idaho at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and I had this great idea to start writing a book based on some of my experiences, but I wanted it to be full of prose like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after a month, I dropped the project because I was just so frustrated. My writing was crap. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have an experience. I thought this is just too big of a project for me. And I got about 10,000 words into it, and they were crap words. They just god awful. But over the next several years, I worked in theater. So I was getting intimate with scripts and playwrights and how playwrights work and use words to craft emotion. And I got into photography. I became quite a good photographer. And I learned how to translate reality into a two-dimensional capture of an instant. And believe it or not, that helped me become a better writer.
Well, it makes sense to me because image is what I want to say, right? Whether it's a picture we're looking at, whether it's an image that's painted for us by a writer, whether it's an image that's actually painted on a piece of paper, or a story that's told, or something we hear. And so I think by you experiencing image in multiple ways, it allowed you more opportunities to be present with it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to my growing awareness of creativity in general, I did take some writers' workshops. And of course, I went to my favorite university, YouTube University, and followed many great writers on there. Brandon Sanderson is I don't like his books necessarily, but he is a great instructor about theme, plot, character, all the important parts about writing and how to paint a picture with words. And I just learned a lot. And after a few years, I picked up the book again and I nearly finished it. And after reading it again, I realized, boy, this is still a pile of crap. And I put it away again for another couple years. And I continued with my other creativity. I continued with photography, a little bit of theater, a little bit of travel. I've lived in a bunch of cool places. But while I was living inside Zion National Park, I picked up the book again. I finished it, and I was pleased with it. I finally read it, and I thought, this is not a pile of crap. And I had other people read it. And here's the thing for me about writing a book. I had to have a lot of other people read it for me because I can't trust my own judgment. My own judgment says, that's crap.
Right. You are rather hard on yourself when it comes to your writing,
which I think benefits the reader.
I think it does too. I think so too, because the harder we are on ourselves, the better our work usually is.
I went through a series of edits, went through several beta readers, and went through a professional editor, Mackenzie, bless her heart. She turned it into an even better piece of art. She dissected my book and made me shift a lot of things around. And at that point, the process started over again. I had to re-edit a lot of things, a lot of beta readers. It took a long time. It took 11 years to write this book. And it was a process. Yeah. Now, what was even more difficult than the writing process was getting inside of myself to write it. It's not just an exciting crime novel. It is partially based on some of my experiences. Mm-hmm. Which experiences are true in the book? I'll never say. That's for me to know and for you to be excited by reading about. What I had to do and how this was part of my self-therapy is that I had to look at my experiences, the ones that caused initial drama and trauma. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had to look at them, I had to dissect them, and I had to recreate them in a reality. Because what had happened is that over the years, I'm not a young man right now. These things happened when I was in my early 20s. The effects of the trauma had taken over as a bigger problem than the trauma itself. And I, working on therapy and counseling to deal with that, but I needed to look at the base issue to see what the reality was. I had to look at that issue and I had to fictionalize it to turn it into something usable for the book. And that process was very therapeutic. It wasn't scary at all. I think enough time had passed between when I was writing the book and the Nexus events that I was able to be a little drier in my examination of them. And at the end of that, I was able to vomit it all out in literary form. So I'm not carrying it with me as much anymore.
And, in some of the therapeutic work that I've done, we do like what's called parts work. And we'll take something or a part of us that is like really reacting to something traumatic, and we separated out so that we're looking at that part of us outside of ourselves. And in that work, I've experienced very similar to what you're talking about, where it allows you to be more objective because you're looking at it versus looking in yourself at it. Does that make sense?
Sure.
It sounds very similar. And I think that there's definitely something to that when we go to work with our traumatic experiences or any experience that's hurt us, right? Like, I don't want to overuse the word trauma. So any experience we've had that's very challenging or difficult, when we can pull it out and look at it in an objective way, it allows us to work with it differently and from a stronger sense of space, I think.
Correct. Looking at it objectively, I was able to not be the man in the cage anymore. I was able to look at the cage from outside, and that turned it into just a thing that happened instead of a thing that happened to me,
Right.
or that I was enmeshed in. And it was extraordinarily valuable to me in my personal life, but especially for the creation of the book. I was able to put a lot of my personal experiences in there, a lot of uncomfortable experiences in there, in a very entertaining way, I think.
And so this is your first book.
It's my very first book, and the main character he's not me. He's cooler than me, and he's worse than me.
Sure.
I'm further along in my healing than he is. He's still kind of avoidance is his main thing. Avoidance and alcohol. That's where he's at in the first book.
Gotcha.
Yeah, The Stone Harvest is the first book, the debut novel, and it takes place up in Idaho. Oddly enough, I wrote it when I was living up in Idaho on a farm, and some of the chickens on his farm happened to be my exact same chickens, which is very appealing. My editor loves the chickens. She was very disappointed that in the second book, the upcoming book, Deadline, there's no chickens.
Oh, I love chickens too.
I'm spoiling that. But yeah, Carl Warren is a former soldier, former police officer. He has moved to Idaho to escape the things that humans do to each other. And he just wants to be left alone. And he just wants to turn his former straw field into a native meadow. That's all he wants to do. He wants to drink his coffee in the morning, wants to drink his bourbon at night. He just wants to be left alone. But unfortunately, things happen to us in life. And in the very first chapter, shit all falls apart.
Well, of course, or there wouldn't be a book.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be a one chapter or a very short essay about a man growing wildflowers with chickens.
With chickens.
That wouldn't sell.
Yeah.
Yes. The second book is coming out in a matter of late summer. I don't have an exact date yet because, as you've mentioned, I'm very hard on myself.
Yeah.
And it's in the never-ending editing cycle right now. But it'll be coming out soon, and it continues Carl Warren's adventures. And he has improved a little bit, and he has regressed a little bit. But I've had people Facebook messaging me and texting me, very anxious for this book to come out.
My dad is.
Your father's one of them. I got a message the other day that I just left the cat out of the bag. Somebody was asking about how are the chickens in the second book.
No.
They are referenced, but there's no chickens in the second book. He just continues his journey, and again, shit happens.
Yeah.
He is a good person at heart, but he's flawed, and he hasn't yet come to terms with all of the things that happened to him. He still thinks they happened to him, not that they just happened. He's not outside the cage yet.
Right.
And that affects how he acts, and it's probably why he acts. There's I don't want to give away too much about the second book.
Does he have a cape complex as well?
Of course, he has a cape complex. There's a reference not to a cape complex, but there's a reference to German mythology in there. There's a certain character in German mythology called the Lorelei, who sits on top of the cliff along the Rhine River. She's a siren. She calls the sailors to their death. And well, gosh dang it, that's all I want to say about that.
I know, and it's hard for me too, because we have talked a lot about not just your second book coming out, right? But you've started working a little bit on your third book. And
Yes,
like as we've talked many times, your writing style is not my genre. I'm a fantasy fiction girl, like sci-fi and fantasy fiction 100%. But just in the amount of time that we've spent talking about your books, I'm like, oh man, I gotta go read these books because it's so interesting. And the way that, like, just in the conversations we've had and the timeline and in moving into the third book, even the third book even sounds so exciting that I want to go back and read the first one. And of course, the second one that's about to come out. So
the third book is still a work in project.
Yeah,
there's about 25,000 words there, and I've got the basic idea, and it's a very exciting book in plan. Carl goes back to Germany. Oddly enough, he goes back to the city that housed the small base that I was stationed at. So I'm basing these stories on territory that I'm intimately familiar with. The first story takes place in Westwood, Idaho, which is a made-up name. I didn't want to use the actual name of the city because artistic license, and a lot of bad things happen, and I didn't want to cast aspersions on the actual city. The next book takes place in another city that I'm very intimate with, Oakland, California. So the places mentioned in the book are real places. They're places that I've walked around, places I've taken pictures of. The third book is going to be the exact same way. And looking at a total of 5-book arc for Carl Warren, where he works through his shit.
I love it. So right now, your first book that took 11 years to get through or to get to is The Stone Harvest, and it's available on Amazon in paperback and as an ebook, right?
Yes.
And isn't your ebook price super low right now?
I may have lowered my ebook price just as a tease to get people interested, and so far it's not hurt my feelings that people have been buying it.
All right, and then the second one, what's the title of book 2 that's coming out later this summer?
Deadlined.
And the cover is so cool. I know you don't have a copy of it, obviously, but I got a sneak peek because I'm your friend. But it's cool. So you all just have to take my word for it. So I would highly recommend you go to Amazon, buy his first book, the ebook, so that you can get up to speed, so that as soon as Deadline comes out, you're ready to go for the second book on Carl Warren. Do you want to read us? I know you have a copy in front of you. Read us the synopsis of book 1.
Oh, the synopsis I could do. I didn't have a selection picked out, but I could do the synopsis.
Okay.
Carl Warren came to small-town Idaho to escape the big city police force, to be free of the ghosts of his past. He wanted chickens instead of a life full of death, sin, and human misery. Instead, he discovers the dirt and ugliness of his new paradise. While sifting through a growing pile of dead bodies, Warren discovers the town has more evil hiding. As the pieces slowly fall into place, Warren realizes he may need skills from his past if he wants to survive. Westwood's web of dangerous secrets and deception requires unraveling.
See, that just scares me. I don't want to read it. But I have to now because I'm attached.
And there's a part in here where his love interest rips his shirt off and they have a hot, steamy shower together.
Okay, now I'll read it. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm serious. No, I like just in our conversations and listening to the depth at which you go to build out your characters and the amount of work that you put into just building all of the scenes and all the interactions has been so interesting from my end of it, especially because I haven't read the book yet. Like I said, this is not my genre at all, but just based on the amount of work you've put in and the discussions we've had around the characters, like it makes me want to go read it and hopefully make it through Dead Bodies.
Well, that's the thing. This was a therapeutic process for me.
Yeah.
I did learn a lot, but I think it's a good book.
My dad loved it.
Your dad seems to be a discriminating reader.
He has read a lot. My dad is the one that introduced me to books when I was a wee babe. So yeah, my dad is a big reader.
I don't ever expect me to be a Stephen King. If it happens, that's swell. But I do hold myself to a standard that I want to release a good book. I want to have an entertaining book that holds weight, that has a message to it, that has a good theme to it. While at the same time, I do want to let others know that they have the ability to do the same thing, to write a book, to paint that picture, to paint the background at their local community theater's next play. They've got the opportunity to take what's inside of them and walk out of their own darkness if they want to. I think that everybody's got their power to retrain themselves. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes some introspection, and it's not always fun, it's not always pretty. It takes the ability to look in the mirror and say, you messed up and you could do better. And sometimes you look at yourself and say, it's okay, it's not your fault. A thing happened and you have to move forward. I think everybody has the ability to do that to some degree. Maybe not write a book, maybe something, but I'm a strong believer that the arts are an avenue for healing.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most beautiful things about, and so beautifully said, by the way, about working with art is you don't have to know what's going to happen. You don't need to have an end product. Like writing the book, can be a little bit different, but even with you, I mean, the reason it took 11 years is because you didn't necessarily know where you were going, right?
I wasn't ready.
Yeah.
I didn't know what to write. I didn't know how to paint that picture.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what the character was. The character would have been much more thin had I finished sooner.
Yeah. And I paint and I work with clay, and it really is, for me, that's like a therapeutic process. Like I don't sell my stuff. I don't put it out on display, and I might gift some to friends and things like that. But there's been times where I've sat down to paint or to work with clay with no motive. I didn't know what was going on. I just listened to some music and start doing some stuff, right? And then next thing you know, there's this thing in front of me that is a perfect representation of what I've been going through. And I'm just like, oh shit, there it is, and it's not about making something good or perfect or beautiful or being productive, but just allowing yourself to be with something that is part of you and within you in a different way. And I think there's something in art that lets us take that kind of, like we were talking about, it makes it objective, where we can pull it out of us and look at it. Art allows us to pull it out of us and look at it in a different way. And I think that's so powerful.
It's a different kind of mirror.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes. I think that's well said. I think that's a good way to put it. The stone harvest was a way for me to pull it out of me over an 11-year process and put it on paper. And I didn't always like what I saw. Didn't always like what I wrote, but it was a reflection.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes reflection is one of the most powerful things that we can experience. It's a gift. Yeah. Well, sir, we are just about at time. I appreciate you being here so much, and I've so enjoyed our conversation this evening. I always ask at the end if there's one thing that you would just like to share or say to everybody. What would that one thing be?
I think that most folks are smarter than they give themselves credit for. If we're able to remove our negative programming or negative thoughts or our self-doubts or our perceived shortcomings, I think if we remove the negativity from our lives, what remains is pretty gosh darn good in most cases.
Yeah.
So it's not always a matter about seeking happiness or finding the golden ring or attaining something new. Maybe it's a matter of stripping down what no longer works for you, and what remains is pretty gosh darn good.
Beautifully said. I love it and agree wholeheartedly. Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Dan.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. You were a wonderful host, a wonderful, gentle host.
We made it.
Yes.
All right, anyone listening or watching, thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for joining us on the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast that live streams every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. I hope you enjoyed this episode.